Find the derivative of g of x equals sine 2x over x, then evaluate g prime of pi over 8. G of x here is the quotient of two functions. The sine of 2x divided by x. We will therefore make use of the quotient rule for the derivative. G prime of x will be the derivative of the numerator, cosine of 2x, then times 2, derivative of sine is cosine, but then 2 for the derivative of the inside, complete the chain rule. Derivative of the numerator times the denominator left alone minus the numerator left alone, sine of 2x, times the derivative of the denominator, that's a 1, and that entire thing divided by the denominator squared. Now let's rewrite this to make it look a little nicer. This 2 and this x can move to the front of the cosine. They're not inside the cosine, so they will move to the front. 2x cosine of 2x. And then minus sine of 2x times a 1 is just minus sine of 2x. All of this divided by x squared. There's our derivative g prime of x. The next thing to do is evaluate g prime of pi over 8. G prime of pi over 8 means to plug a pi over 8 in for each of the x's. So that means we have a 2 times pi over 8, the cosine of 2 pi over 8, minus the sine of 2 pi over 8, all divided by pi over 8 quantity squared. Now in the numerator, 2 pi over 8 can reduce to pi over 4 everywhere we see it. So we have pi over 4 cosine of pi over 4 minus the sine of pi over 4, and then all of this divided by, let's square each of these, pi squared, and then 8 squared is a 64. Now, back in the numerator, we will have pi over 4 times the cosine of pi over 4, which is root 2 over 2, minus the sine of pi over 4, which is also root 2 over 2, and then this entire thing over pi squared over 64. So g prime of pi over 8 equals, multiplying pi over 4 times root 2 over 2, multiply the numerators, we will have pi times root 2 over 4 times 2, which is an 8, and then minus root 2 over 2. We're going to want to get a common denominator between those, and therefore I'm going to multiply that second fraction by 4 over 4, and then this entire thing is over pi squared over 64. So back in the numerator, I will have pi root 2 minus root 2 times 4, which is 4 root 2, and then they're over a common denominator at this point of 8, and the entire thing over pi squared over 64. We can now reciprocate the denominator fraction and multiply with the numerator fraction, so we have pi root 2 minus 4 root 2 over 8 times the reciprocal, which is 64 over pi squared. Now the 8 and the 64 can cancel down to become an 8. That 8 is going to distribute in that entire numerator. But we may want to keep it factored out. It is multiplying the entire numerator. So 8 times pi root 2 minus 4 root 2 all over pi squared. The last thing maybe to do is we can factor a root 2 out of the numerator. So let's write g prime of pi over 8 as 8 times root 2 times pi minus 4 all over pi squared, and that's g prime of pi over 8. 8 root 2 pi minus 4 all over pi squared.